In the past several sermons that I've brought to you, I've dealt with important factors in early church history and how the church went off track rather quickly after the apostles. And we dealt with the apostasy of the church, the Roman papal history, the Protestant Reformation, and then came to the Millerite movement in the United States. And probably the most important of those messages was in the late 1840s, the formulation of the teachings in the context of the three angels' messages that became what Seventh Adventist beliefs are. And that was all pounded out in New England and New York. And then the next message was on the spread of the message to the present-day Midwest, what they called the West, with formal organization of the Seventh Adventist Church in Michigan. My last message on our church history focused on some first accomplishments centered in Battle Creek, Michigan, like the first health center, Western Health Reform Institute, later Battle Creek Sanitarium under John Harvey Kellogg's leadership, and that it became world famous. The first college, Battle Creek College, 1874, the first missionary going overseas, also 1874. And the spread of the work in the United States by preachers and evangelists, establishing churches and eventually organizing additional state conferences over time. The key thing is wherever there were greater numbers of converts and the resources, ideas for having their own health sanitarium and colleges would spring up. So in Healdsburg and St. Helena, California, that became one of the early centers with Healdsburg College, later PUC, and St. Helena Sanitarium. And then Lancaster, Massachusetts, the same year, started South Lancaster Academy, which eventually became Atlantic Union College. And then there was the New England, it was a Stoneham Sanitarium, and not that far from Lancaster. And so these places were early places that had schools and health work. And then Lincoln, Nebraska, and then Walla Walla, Washington. These were the earliest ones. Now, due to the Civil War, the South was not a welcoming place for people from the North to come do evangelism. So the work there lagged behind more than a decade, almost 2 decades. Just couldn't go down there and get results. Northerners just were not allowed. Now, to study Adventist history further would take us down 4 themes. And I've kind of almost outlined these 4 themes already. But probably the one that would be the most interesting to most people would be the history of mission work spreading throughout the world with stories of some great missionary accomplishments. Another theme would be the history of the establishing publishing houses in various parts of the world and conferences in other parts of the world. And those two kind of go together, missionary work and publishing houses and organization. But then you could study it strictly on the line of the history of health work and establishment of sanitariums, later hospitals. And that's where Loma Linda would come into the study. And the 4th theme would be the history of Seventh-day Adventist education and the establishment of a few colleges and many academies and thousands of elementary schools. So let's just kind of assess those 4 themes from the beginning. Mission work had a very slow start. Took quite a while for them to realize they needed to actually go to other countries. But once it got going, it became dynamic for several decades. The publishing work grew all over the world, and most of that was positive, except for an interim with a theological war between Pacific Press and Review and Herald, Wagner and Jones versus Uriah Smith and George Butler. And as you probably know, that resulted in a culmination in a general conference session in Minneapolis, 1888. The health work got off to an impressive start under the direction of John Harvey Kellogg, Battle Creek became world famous. And then many years later, the health work got into a lot of trouble, also because of John Harvey Kellogg. And then the fourth line, Seventh-day Adventist education, struggled right from the beginning. Couldn't get it right. They had trouble getting how to do the things Ellen White described that God had showed her in vision. People in that day could only see education as intellectual, the training of the head. And that's why the title is The Head, the Heart, and the Hand, because she said the heart and the hand needed to be just as important as the head. And she wanted the new college in Battle Creek to have land for an agricultural business and training, but that didn't seem important to most leaders. And she wanted the school in the country, but it was more convenient to have it in the city of Battle Creek. They just didn't see why it mattered. And in the early days of Battle Creek, conflicts over how to do education evolved into personality conflicts that embroiled the whole Battle Creek church, and it resulted in the shutting down of Battle Creek College. It was reopened under the leadership of William Prescott, a man of great intellect and deep spiritual piety. He proved to be an effective leader, one of the best of second-generation leaders, and he brought stability to the college. Even though he was steeped in classical education himself, he had enough flexibility to make some progress with Ellen White's counsel. But there wasn't enough land with the college for an agricultural program such as the prophetess called for. And this makes me think of Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 1, 24-25 says, "But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." You see, people just couldn't see the wisdom of God. Ellen White's counsels appeared to be foolishness or weakness. But 2 chapters later says, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. But it's man's so-called wisdom that is foolishness." So the first aim of education has to be to give our children, youth, and ourselves a thorough knowledge and understanding of God and His Word, so we don't get confused with the wisdom of the world. Otherwise, we're just part of the darkness that's all around us that Isaiah refers to. "Behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the people." You see, the glory of God's truth needs to be in the minds and the hearts of His people. And this can only happen by implanting the Scriptures in our minds. So then faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. So the first aim of education is to understand and know God and His Word. The second aim of education has to be to lead our children and youth to complete surrender of their lives to the will of Jesus, to be converted, to be born again. And that's why Ellen White writes in Education, page 30, "In the highest sense, the work of education and the work of redemption are one." I mean, think about it. If we had a great education and we ended up being lost, could that be satisfactory? Of course not. Now, but keep in mind, I mean, we all know that we cannot force one soul to surrender to Christ. That can only be someone's free choice. However, it is the privilege of every parent and every teacher to make the claims of Christ upon the lives of the children and youth and anyone else as attractive and meaningful as possible. And that means we need the help of the Holy Spirit. Jesus said, but the Helper, He said the Comforter in the King James, the Comforter, the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, He will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all things that I said to you. So, of course, the Holy Spirit has to be the ultimate teacher. And people born of the Holy Spirit seek God's will and guidance They want the wisdom that comes from God, not the wisdom of men. All right, so the first aim of education is to know God, to know His Word. The second aim of education is full surrender and conversion. What should follow true conversion? So the third aim of education is to educate our children and youth and ourselves to be in service for God and man. We must share our wonderful Jesus. And again, in Isaiah it says, "You are my witnesses," said the Lord, "and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am He. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me." And this kind of leads me to this quote from Fundamentals of Education, Christian Education. I really like this. It says, "True Christian will renew the mind and transform the character." That's the heart, right? That's the heart of education, reaching the heart. Renew the mind and transform the character, and enable us to understand the voice of God, and will fit the learned to become a co-worker with Christ. So the object of education is for people to become co-workers. Could you imagine if people went through a whole course of study, or several people went through the same school and didn't become workers for Christ or witnesses for Christ? Could we claim that to be a true Christian education? I don't think we could. So what is the one super big purpose on God's part for education and for our lives? And to help you know where I'm going, I want you to consider how God created us. God created mankind in His image. And then how sin has largely defaced the image of God in man. Would any education that falls short of providing a remedy for sin satisfy God? It couldn't, could it? And so, Counsels to Parents, Teachers, and Students, page 49, says, to bring man back into harmony with God, so to elevate and ennoble his moral nature, that's the heart, that he may again reflect the image of the Creator, is the great purpose of all the education and discipline of life. So the plan of redemption, the cross of Christ, new life in the Spirit are all part of true education. Education, page 13. I like this one. And fortunately, I left out a lot. There's a lot in this paragraph that's great. That's not here. But true education is our harmonious development of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual powers. It prepares the student for the joy of service in this world and the higher joy of wider service in the world to come. You know, I find that kind of exciting because, in my life, in my career, when I made a job change, I was excited about this new job. And then I'm being told here that I have a calling for a higher joy of wider service in the world to come. Can you imagine being able to work where there's no more sin and no more obstacles? And everything's great success. That just that appeals to me a lot. But let's consider earlier in the statement, true education is the harmonious development of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual powers. The physical, mental, spiritual powers. Let's look at the title slide again. Which part is the physical? The hand, right? The mental, the head, and the spiritual? Yeah, so it's really the same thing. Now, sometimes Ellen White refers to the physical as the body. She talks about how important it is to strengthen the body, keep it healthy in education. And she sometimes refers to the mental as the mind, the head. And the spiritual powers, she often refers to, this is the heart, she often refers to as the soul, or the character, or the moral nature. So which of these three has been the biggest challenge to make a part of a school program, to bring into education? Well, it's a lot easier if I ask which one's the easiest. So let's start there. The one that is easiest to see and include is the head, the mental. After all, that is usually what we see school is for, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic, and other subjects. Intellectual pursuits. But public school can do that. In the early Battle Creek days, this is all they thought education was, the intellectual pursuit. That's what a classical education was. It's all training of the head, the mind, the intellect. And so that part, everybody knew how to do, pretty much. And even today, that's the part people understand the best. Reaching the heart, developing character, is more challenging. But at least Christians do see that this matters for a Christian education, right? At least I hope we all do. But what about the hand? What does that involve? I want you to think about this. Before there was even sin in this world, God committed the care of the garden to Adam and Eve. Genesis 2:15 says to dress it and to keep it. Sometimes we think that work was because of sin. No, work wasn't because of sin. Sweating at your brow was because of sin. It became a lot harder. But work was never a result of sin. Work was a blessing before there was sin. And in Education, page 21, and this is the same paragraph that talked about the care of the garden being given to Adam and Eve to dress it and keep it, quoting Genesis 2:15, the same paragraph goes on to say, useful occupation was appointed them as a blessing to strengthen the body, to expand the mind, and to develop the character. So this is education of the hand, to use and train the hands. Let's look at that again. Useful occupation was appointed them as a blessing to strengthen the body. So when they work with their hands, it brings exercise, strengthens the body, but it also expands the mind and develops character. So it's labor. The blessing that strengthens the body is labor or work, or as she calls it here, useful occupation, and it strengthens the body, expands the mind, the head, and develops the character, the spiritual power, the moral nature, the heart. This is kind of cool, think about it. So useful occupation in a garden engages all three, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. Do you see why it's important? And this was important before there was sin, and if anything, it gained added importance after sin damaged the human race. When I was a kid growing up, I didn't see it this way. Chores. I wanted to hurry up and get those done so I could go play. Now, I want you to consider Jesus' childhood. Jesus' childhood was actually a model of this principle. In Desire of Ages 72, it tells us that Jesus was a member of a poor family, and he played, quote, his part in bearing the burden of the household. He learned a trade and with his own hands worked in the carpenter shop with Joseph. Now, he didn't do it grudgingly. She says he faithfully and cheerfully acted his part. It was a part of Jesus' education. Jesus followed the divine plan of education. And so in Education, page 77, we have a very short summary of the divine plan of education. She says there that Jesus' education was from, quote, the heaven-appointed sources. There's 4 of them here. From useful work, from the study of the scriptures and of nature, and the experiences of life. When I was in my first year teaching, in prayer meeting, we came across this passage for some reason. I don't remember why, but I've always remembered what the pastor said about it. He said Jesus was educated by news. He says news is the acronym. N for nature, E for experiences of life, W for work, S for scriptures. Jesus' educational plan was news. And that helps you remember the 4 essentials of the 4 heaven-appointed sources for education. Now, between school and home, it's not hard to cover these during the years children are young. You know, parents can teach much of what's here. They can teach useful work. They can talk with their kids about what life is teaching them. They can teach scriptures and nature. And the teacher at school can do it too. useful work becomes more of a challenge for school programs when children get older, like in academy and college. And this was what was most challenging at Battle Creek College. It's what they couldn't seem to do. In 1886, a fellow by the name of Edward Sutherland enrolled at Battle Creek College. Edward's father was trained to be a teacher in Greek and Latin at a school of higher learning in Glasgow, Scotland. And then his parents migrated to Wisconsin, and he and his wife went with them. And Edward was actually born while they were crossing the Mississippi River. So here he was, trained to teach Greek and Latin, and he took up farming in Wisconsin, good farmland in Wisconsin. In his early teens, Edward had his own onion business. His father said, yeah, you can do your own work here and make some money and see how you do. So here he was, just an early teen, and he planted a bunch of onions, and he dried them and sold them as like onion flakes, and he made quite a bit of money. He was already a successful entrepreneur in practical wisdom and business, and he was probably only 14 or 15 years old. And his father saw that Ed would be a very good farmer, but Ed wanted to go to college. Well, Ed did leave for college. He did not leave home on good terms. These farmers are tough. Well, he was there at Battle Creek, and after he had a year of school, he took a summer to do colporteuring, and his home base was Minneapolis, Minnesota, summer of 1888. Now that should ring a few bells. He was selling books to earn money for his next school year, and he was able, as just a young college student, to sneak into the general conference session and listen to Jones and Wagner and all this discussion about righteousness by faith. And the light on righteousness by faith changed his life and was a motivator to him the rest of his life. Now that fall, the fall of 88, that fall semester, new students were coming, and Ed became real good friends with a fellow named Percy McGann. And the two were like David and Jonathan for the rest of their lives. And as Providence would have it, Percy must have needed financial help or something, and Ellen knew about it, and she invited Percy to come live at her house. And Edward often visited Percy there and had many opportunities to discuss things with Mother White, as they called her the rest of their lives, term of endearment. Percy was a couple of years younger than Edward, but he had a great influence on Edward. Ed noticed that Percy got his exercise by doing useful and profitable work. Percy was a proficient baker and cook, and wasn't long before they made him he managed the bakery while he was a student. Percy also worked in the machine shop and became very proficient with tools. Through work, Percy kept learning and mastering skills. And Edward watched him and said, it's like he's really trying to master everything. Well, Edward had skills as well, because, he grew up on a farm, and he admired Percy's tackling of work. But that's not how Ed thought you should get exercise. Ed got his exercise playing football and baseball. Major League Baseball had started in the United States by then, and it was gaining a national attraction. And students at Battle Creek were definitely interested in that. And so one day, Edward took a hold of Percy's strong arm. He says, we need another man on our baseball team, a man with that kind of muscle, Percy. Not interested. Percy turned away. But why do you think you should work all the time? Percy said, let's say I can't regard any activity as recreation suitable for me, unless it confers benefit on someone. And then Edward insisted, surely vigorous exercise is helpful and necessary for the body. Percy said, yes, exercise is good and necessary, but to my way of thinking, such exercise can be gotten in profitable ways. True recreation brings blessings to others. Ed Sutherland thought long and hard about that, trying to comprehend Percy's way of thinking. And I'll admit, when I was a college student, I wouldn't have understood it either. Before Edward graduated in 1890, he and a girl named Sally found that they had common goals and mutual attraction and agreed to get married. So I got a picture of them both here. There's Ed and his wife Sally. Ed was called to become the principal of an academy near Minneapolis, Minnesota. Percy remained as a student at Battle Creek, at least for a while. But then they noticed Percy was a master at history, and they asked him to start teaching history classes. So before he even graduated, he became part of staff. But while Percy was there, he was studying everything Ellen White had written on education. Now, they didn't have the book Education then, where everything's conveniently put together. So he's looking and reviewing Herald articles and just looking at some of the early testimonies that came out. And of course, he could ask Ellen White questions, at least until she went to Australia. But in the process of studying on education, he came across some of her counsels on diet and decided to go vegetarian. Percy later influenced both Edward and Sally to become vegetarians as well. And then the General Conference leadership asked Edward and Sally to come back to Battle Creek College, and they wanted him to teach Bible. Percy and Ed had more time to talk, and they were fully aware that Mother White had given counsel for schools to be in country locations with plenty of fertile land, and for teachers and students to work side by side to make successful work in supporting themselves. They knew that she had tried to get the leaders to move Battle Creek College to a country location. But now she was heading to Australia, where she hoped a school could be established and carried forward according to God's plan. So let's just take a look at some of the things that Percy and Ed discussed. It wasn't in their heads. Ellen White was clear it would be a great aid in educational work could every school be so situated as to afford the pupils land for cultivation and access to fields and woods. So here at Mentone, we have a garden, we have land for cultivation because we're trying to follow spirit prophecy. Not doing so good on fields and woods, but at least they're not too far away. As a rule, the exercise most beneficial to the youth will be found in useful employment. So did Percy get his idea from her, or did he get that before he even knew she said that? Interesting, isn't it? Education 217. So far as possible, facilities for manual training should be connected with every school. To a great degree, such training would supply the place of the gymnasium, with the additional benefit of affording valuable discipline. It's interesting. She talks about how every school should have manual training. And another place, I didn't put this quote up, it's actually on the very next page. She says that every youth on leaving our schools should have proficiency in a trade, that they could actually support themselves if needed. Oh, another thing here, she says facilities for manual training should be connected to every school, and that could, in many places, replace a gymnasium. But over time, gymnasiums were viewed as much more valuable. Education 219, no line of manual training is of more value than agriculture. Kind of the Garden of Eden thing. And she called agriculture the A, B, and C of true education. And then let teachers share the work with the students and show what results can be achieved through skillful, intelligent effort. I just have to add something here. I didn't plan to say it this morning, but I did, and it's a good thing to share, so I'm going to share this now. My brother-in-law, who has passed away, my oldest sister's husband, he grew up on a farm, and he didn't get to play sports that much on the farm, but he liked sports. And so when he came to AUC, he was a PE major. He wanted to be a coach and teach sports. But when he needed a job, I don't know if you know it, PE teachers are a dime a dozen, because a lot of guys go to college and want to major in PE and go be teachers. And so there was no job. And eventually, he managed a broom shop for Union Springs Academy in New York. And as the manager of the broom shop, he loved work. I mean, he grew up on the farm. He was strong. And he would often challenge students to race to see how many brooms they could bind and see if they could do as many as him. He just had fun working. And he wasn't a teacher teaching classes, although every once in a while he might get a chance to do a PE class during the years he was there. But he worked with the students. And most of those students, especially the guys, when they wanted advice or counsel, they went to him and they didn't go to the teaching teachers. Because in the classroom, you can't get as close to kids as you can when you're working with them, side by side, one-on-one. And so when LOI said teachers need to work with students, she meant every teacher and every administrator should be part of that, because that way their influence could be greatly enlarged. It's the one-on-one stuff that makes the big difference in kids' lives, not the upfront teaching, even though that can be impactful. So I saw this with my own eyes because I visited often, and I would see the way the students loved to be around him. Well, let's see. There's one more I want to share that I'm sure Ed and Percy discussed. From Education 220. Practical work encourages close observation and independent thought. Rightly performed, it tends to develop that practical wisdom which we call common sense. Do we need more common sense in the world today? I mean, we have the greatest deficiency of common sense. It's hard. I mean, I often refer to common sense as uncommon sense because it's getting more and more rare. But think about this. Common sense isn't developed by academic classes. Common sense is developed by work. And it develops practical wisdom. And I've seen this because even though I didn't grow up on a farm, I grew up near one, and my brother worked on that farm a lot, and we went down a lot because we liked being around the farm. And I learned a few things, but when I got to college, I became acquainted with students that came from farms, and one of them was a girl, and I liked her. So I went out to her farm. Her father wasn't too fond of me. He thought I was city slicker. He thought I was a ladies' man, and he said that kid has no common sense. So he didn't think I was a good match for his daughter, but he did at least acknowledge that I worked hard. He worked me hard to see what I had, and I knew I was being tested, so I worked my hide off, and at least he acknowledged that I knew how to carry myself up, pick myself up on my own bootstraps. So I won his respect in that way. Didn't win his approval for his daughter, so that kind of went by the wayside. But I became friends with a couple of guys my age that were farmers on my first teaching job, and I often went out to the farm to talk with them, and they had unbelievable wisdom compared to most of my college friends. These guys thought things through, and they had common sense that impressed me. So I do know that training of the hand builds common sense, working with hands. Now, my dad was a hands-on guy, and he had a lot of common sense. My brothers had those skills, but because I did good in school, I devalued those things, and I didn't develop the aptitude I had. I had the aptitude because in my family, everybody was hands-on. Because I did good in school and got accolades for it, I started focusing on just the training of the head. And in later years, when I needed help with things, my brother Tim would fix my car and say, "How come you can't do it, college boy?" They'd make fun of me. But when they wanted to know about history, they talked to me. But when something needed to be done, they said, "Get out of the way." And so I started realizing that I had an imbalanced education. My education was very imbalanced, and most people's is. And most of Adventist history is imbalanced education. But there are exceptions. So anyway, these are the things that Percy McGinn and Edward Sutherland were seeing was missing at Battle Creek. All these things were missing at Battle Creek. Now, Battle Creek did have baseball and football games because the president, Prescott, said, well, we have to allow for exercise. Exercise is needed, and they don't have anything else. Now, Edward did run into a dilemma as a vegetarian because the Battle Creek cafeteria served meat at just about every meal. And he's teaching students in a Bible class in Genesis, and right at the beginning, there's the original diet, and these students are getting convicted. So they're talking about it. And then when he gets to Genesis 9, they see that eating meat was allowed to shorten their life, or their lifespan shortened. And so, things started, talk about vegetarian meeting started going all around the campus. And so what happened is Prescott called Edward Sutherland into his office. So what's going on here? We got students finding fault with the food in the cafeteria. We don't need any of that. So I understand you're teaching them that we should be serving vegetarian only. And then Prescott said, we do have 2 tables where people can eat that don't want to eat by people eating meat. Sutherland says, that's not really the point. And Sutherland defended his position. Prescott told him, look, we can't be stirring up and causing discord among the staff. Sutherland knew he needed to back off a bit, but he was not daunted by it at all. And the amazing thing about it is Prescott himself decided a few years later to be a vegetarian. And eventually, the cafeteria menu became vegetarian, but not right away. So around that time, 1892, the General Conference leaders chose young Edward Sutherland to be the principal of a new college to be started up in Walla Walla, Washington. He wasn't even 30 years old yet. They designated William Prescott to be the president at the same time he was president of Battle Creek College. So Sutherland would be answerable to Prescott. Now, Ed had, but keep in mind these 2 schools are about 2,000 miles apart. And so Prescott's not going to be there very much. So Ed Sutherland had to plan the curriculum, write and print a catalog, hire the teaching staff, give oversight of the laborers who were still building the college building that wasn't done yet. And then he had to promote the college in the area and recruit students. Does that sound exhausting? Sound like a job for 3 or 4 men instead of 1? So they had a 4-story building. It was ready enough to begin by December. And they started with 91 students. This is what it looked like pretty early on. 4 stories. Can you imagine 91 students and all the staff and all live in that one building? And it's going to be the administrative offices, the classrooms, and the dormitory rooms, everything. And while they started school, the construction people are still finishing dorm rooms on the inside. And over the next 2 months, they added almost 70 more students as rooms became available. So they ended up with 165 students partway through the year. Now, one thing that had really upset Sutherland is the land had been purchased before he got there, and the people that were responsible for it, they had purchased 120 acres, but they kept thinking, we need money, so they kept selling off parcels. by the time he got there, there was only 20 acres left. And he was pretty upset. He goes, they're making the same mistakes that they made with Battle Creek. So, but Sutherland made sure they had enough land, and this is how he did it. And I don't know how he had the money, but the nation dropped into a financial collapse partway during that first school year. And all these farmers that had bought land were willing to sell it back. He bought 80 acres back. And he had enough land. He hired a farm manager, and with students and staff both involved, they found that the land there produced wonderful orchards. You know, a lot of apples you buy in the store come from the Northwest, right? And produce great gardens. And the fields produce exceptionally tasty wheat. Ed's wife, Sally, said, the bread tastes better here. And he says, it's that wheat. It's great. So Sutherland got up at 5 every morning during weekdays and to handle his end of a cross-cut saw with a student that was his partner. He and the student would cut firewood every morning. He believed in following the Spirit Prophecy Council on manual labor and working with students. Now, that's a pretty stark picture there. So let's give you a picture that has those trees a little more filled out and it's in color. And it also shows that the wings are bigger. The first picture showed the wings didn't stick out that much. The wings were the dormitories. And so this one shows that they go back pretty far. Now, the second year at Walla Walla, some new staff were hired and joined the Walla Walla College. Now, back at Battle Creek, William Prescott had picked out this first-year female student and asked her to leave school early and go help at Walla Walla. Her name was Bessie DeGraw. And she told Prescott, I'll only go if you promise me they won't ask me to be the preceptress. That's the girls' dean of the dormitory. She didn't want to do that. I mean, after all, there'll probably be students older than her. She doesn't want to do that. And so she comes out, and I got a picture of her with Sally Sutherland. Sally Sutherland has a little more graceful, maybe lady look. I don't know. Bessie DeGraw, how would you describe her face? You can just see there's a little spunk in this girl, can't you? Just the look. Anyway, Ed asked her to be the preceptress. She did not want to do that. But one thing that Ed Sutherland had was powers of persuasion. And somehow he made a deal with her, and she agreed to be basically the girls' dean. And she's going to be in charge of a bunch of girls her own age, some even older. But, you know, there was something about her. They all loved her, and she was in charge. She was an amazing person. And Prescott must have seen that and knew she would be a great help there. And they called her Miss Bessie DeGraw, and she became a part of Edward and Sally Sutherland's team for the rest of her life. Stalwart believer in all the counsels on education written by Ellen White, believed that Ed Sutherland knew what he was doing, and she was a supporter. Reports on the establishment of Avondale College in Australia inspired them all the more. 1897, Sutherland had been the principal and then became the president of Walla Walla. Prescott saw enough to know he didn't need to oversight anything. And so he had been the president most of that time, 5 years. Then it was a general conference session, and Edward Sutherland was asked to give a report on the new school in Walla Walla. And the leaders were inspired by Sutherland's leadership at Walla Walla. All the successful agriculture program, the industries that had been started, the manual training that was going on. They said, I think he gets what Ellen White was saying. And they didn't even get it, but listening to him explain things, they were starting to understand her counsel better. And at the GC session toward the end, they elected him to be the new president of Battle Creek College. If he had known what he was getting into, he probably would have said no. Because that would prove to be a greater challenge than was starting a brand new college. But it would be a greater challenge for different reasons. People set in their ways don't like change. Well, when he got there, Percy McGann, this is probably a little older picture, but Percy had been on the faculty at Battle Creek College for quite a while, and he was excited that Ed was coming back, and he was ready to support his friend as the new president of Battle Creek. The General Conference somehow saw to it that Bessie DeGraw also got a call to Battle Creek, and so she made the move, along with, of course, Ed's wife, Sally, and they were ready to support Ed Sutherland, all of them. Ellen White had written some strong warnings to Battle Creek about how if Jesus entered their institutions of learning, he would cleanse the schools there like he cleansed the temple. That's pretty strong. And she said they had chosen darkness rather than light. Now, keep in mind that she still supported Battle Creek College, except for around the time it closed. She actually advised parents not to send their students there for that little period of time. So even though things aren't the way they're supposed to be at Battle Creek, sometimes revival would break out among the students, and Ellen White would write glowing things about the Holy Spirit's work there. But overall, she wasn't satisfied. They were not following the counsel. And the General Conference president, Olson, admitted right in the Battle Creek Church that the reformation Ellen's letters called for had not been made. And now here's Sutherland coming in. And he began making reforms. The faculty members used to prior management didn't respond well, at least some of them. You know, you kind of know when people aren't with you, when they get kind of distant, they avoid you. There's a reserve. Ed and Sally and Percy and Bessie DeGraw were feeling it. Some students complained too. And the second year enrollment went down quite a bit. And the third year it went down some more. And even though faculty were asking questions and skeptical, Sutherland, because of his powers of persuasion, was able to carry out many changes and genuine improvements followed. And there were some staff that actually supported him, but not a majority. But the big problem was Battle Creek sat on only 7 acres of land, way too small to get a good agricultural program going like they had at Walla Walla. I imagine some days he looked back on Walla Walla with fondness. Well, Sutherland looked around the property to see what land could possibly be turned into gardens and grow crops. Even though they only had 7 acres, he noticed there was one big space. The baseball field and a tennis court. Would he dare? He decided they had to plow up the baseball field and the tennis court. Percy McGann drove the team. Ed Sutherland guided the plow. And a big guy named J.G. Lamson, who weighed 225 pounds, sat on the beam to help break the sod. Do you think there were people who weren't happy? Sure. But why were they so sure it was the right thing to do? Because even though they didn't have the book education, they found these counsels in some of Ellen's letters and in articles. It says, exercise in a gymnasium, however well conducted, cannot supply the place of recreation in the open air. And for this, our schools should afford better opportunity. Vigorous exercise the pupils must have. Now, that's just talking about exercise there, but then on the same page, Education 210, she addresses football and boxing. She calls them schools of brutality that develop the love of domination, pride and mere brute force, exerts a demoralizing power on youth. And I can say that I know all this by experience because in my neighborhood, we played tackle football without equipment when we wanted to play. And sometimes it was nasty. And usually my fights with my brother Tim, the worst ones happened in these situations. And I love smashing people. I did. I mean, and anyone who watches the NFL and enjoys that a lot probably can relate. And I have to admit, I sometimes watch highlights. I don't have television, so I don't watch games, but highlights sometimes I watch. And there's something about all that power out there that just draws. But she says it exerts a demoralizing power on youth. Love of domination. That was my life. We even had our own boxing gloves. My parents bought us boxing gloves for Christmas one time. And after we did some boxing for a while, I wondered what was wrong with my parents because we were getting in serious fights with that stuff. We set up a ring, brought neighbors in, and we were having our rounds. And, I just remember my brother Tim had finesse, and he was out boxing my oldest brother Eugene and his friends. And my brother Eugene got mad because he couldn't beat him, so he went charging into him like a windmill, but he was hitting him here where there's no padding, and you could really hurt somebody. And I just remember thinking, this is crazy. And I guess my parents thought a bunch of boys need to get all that energy worked out. Well, that wasn't the way to do it, that's for sure. So I understand this statement, but on the same page, she says this: other athletic games, though not so brutalizing, stimulate the love of pleasure and excitement, thus fostering a distaste for useful labor, a disposition to shun practical duties and responsibilities. And that one I can relate to too, because athletic games was all I cared about. And if I had to do chores, trying to figure out how to get out of it or shorten it or do it real fast so I could get it done and go back to games, that's what I was all about. And once in a while, I actually had fun doing work. I didn't even know that was possible, but once in a while it happened. Because my brother-in-law, growing up on a farm, he loved to work hard and he made it fun. And so a few times I did work with him and I think, that was cool. That was fun. And it's more rewarding than going out and trying to make somebody look stupid. Well, of course, some faculty and students were upset about plowing up the baseball field and the tennis court. However, as I mentioned, several faculty were supportive, as was the chairman of the board. His name was A.T. Jones, and he had some influence. And they had the support of John Harvey Kellogg, by far the biggest influence in Battle Creek. And Battle Creek Sanitarium was right across the road. And Ellen White's councils were in harmony with what they did. Ed and Sally Sutherland, Bessie DeGraw, and Percy McGann, they met many times in their special prayer room to ask for God's guidance as they were leading a reform movement at Battle Creek. And then heavenly blessings began to become evident, and that helped hold back the critics. Financial relief was very evident, and people were praising God for the improvement in the finances. And spiritual revival came among the students and some of the staff. But the question for you, because you might be wondering, why is he preaching about this from old history? Let me ask you something. Has this history affected your life? If you don't know it, you're blind. Because the reason I'm a victim of an unbalanced education is because the counsels haven't been followed for a long time. If you had been there, would you have been for or against Edward Sutherland? And maybe I should ask it this way. Forget Ed Sutherland. How about now? My last Spirit Prophecy quote from Councils of Parents Teaching Students 274 says, labor is still a source of happiness and development. I found out by accident that it could be happy. Usually I did it grudgingly. But labor is still a source of happiness and development. If the right attitude, it will be happiness. And a safeguard against temptation. Wow, that sounds pretty important. Its discipline places a check on self-indulgence and promotes industry, purity, and firmness. Thus, it becomes part of God's great plan for our recovery from the fall. It's just as important as it was in the Garden of Eden, if not more. So I just want to close with this, because sometimes people have a hard time really understanding God's ways, understanding the wisdom of God and not going by the wisdom of man. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding, your own wisdom. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Now, I'm going to admit, when I was an academy and college student, I would not have liked the presentation I just did. I would not have liked it. Praise God, though, I've grown up. The key thing is, will we really trust God's way? Or we just want to trust the wisdom of men? The history of Adventist education is mostly trusting the wisdom of men, but there are some happy exceptions. So our closing song is Father, Lead Me Day by Day, page 482.